All right, gentlemen. So today we get to talk about something that I know for sure I'm going to enjoy because I enjoy training. I enjoy training hard. I'm sure most of our listeners can resonate with that. We're going to talk about failure, training to failure. We're going to open up the topic, perhaps better identify what failure is, and go over how we've applied what we know when it comes to ourselves, when it comes to our athletes. Um, and yeah, it should be. There's going to be a lot of things to break apart here because it's a little bit less straightforward than I think a lot of people out there might assume. Um, so, Eric, what is training to failure, man? Like, have you
Nobody
scientists
knows.
agreed on this one yet?
No, it's one of the great mysteries. Like, why did the Big Bang happen? And why are babies occasionally born with tails? Hint: it's remnants of evolution, like we think. But anyway, no. In all seriousness, failure. It seems like a really obvious thing. Like if we're doing a YouTube video, like yeah, failure. Everyone knows what that is, failure. But then when you really start to talk to people, you start to realize that they're actually saying different things. And this goes all the way back, like historically, to like if you look at Mike Menser and even before that, like when they meant failure, wasn't no joke. And I'm really glad we got Jeff on this discussion because he can talk about his like practical experiences with, what it really means. And when he got involved with like high intensity training back in the day, the difference between that and probably the casual gym rat, or even maybe the average bodybuilder's perception of what failure is. But it's actually a similar story in the research. There's been a fair amount of research on the topic of the importance or even necessity of going to muscular failure, quote unquote, for hypertrophy. Like, is it beneficial? Is it equivocal? Does it not make a difference? What's the kind? Is it a moderating factor? What have you? And that has come to the point now where we've actually got a couple recently published meta-analyses, which is great. Don't get me wrong, that are on the topic of the effect of training to failure on hypertrophy and strength and other things. However, I was just a part of a really great publication that came out of Dr. Zerdos's lab, led by Josh Peeland from Data-Driven Strength, who's also doing his master's there, and really, I think a really important paper because we discussed like, yeah, it's great that we meta-analyzed all these studies, but a meta-analysis, it needs to be done pretty well for it to really be that guiding light at the top of like the hierarchy of evidence. And a key aspect of that is the level of what's called heterogeneity in the data. And that just means like how similar are the studies we're comparing. Because the difference between saying, hey, I have a meta-analysis that had 400 participants across 10 studies in it, and like a different field where they go, hey, I have a randomized controlled trial with 400 participants in this single study that are in this multi-site like hospital comparison, is that in that multi-site hospital study on, let's say, like a drug trial, every single one of those sites replicated the protocols, had the same inclusion criteria, used exact same methods. But the 400 participants in that meta-analysis are distributed across those 10 studies that whoever meta-analyzed them said, you know what, these are similar enough to meet my inclusion criteria. So they're not perfect comparisons, but that's the best we got in our wee little sports nutrition field where, most studies only have like 10 to 20 people in them anyway. So what that means is that if you have two different studies and they have different definitions of failure, you could plausibly expect them to have different outcomes. And then the aggregated effect size and differences between the non-failure and failure conditions could be influenced by that. More importantly, though, just as difficult as it is to define failure, it's actually difficult to define and control for non-failure in these comparative groups. So, like, let's use an example. Let's say we've got a group that is training to quote-unquote failure, and the authors don't specify exactly what that means, which unfortunately is reasonably common. And then in the other group, they give them a percentage 1RM-based training, and they assign them the number of reps you'd expect would, be challenging but shouldn't result in failure. There's issues on both sides of that. So let's say you have someone doing like 5 sets of 5 at, 75% of 1RM. You'd think for most people that should be like half the reps that they could do. Unfortunately, we have data suggesting that people, like an individual, if you grab a random person off the street, even if they're trained, the number of reps they can do at 75% of 1RM could be drastically different. There's some people who will get 6 on like probably the low end, if I had to guess, and there's some people who could get maybe close to 20 on the high end. So that person who can only get 6 or 7 reps at 75% of 1RM in the quote unquote non-failure group might be hitting close to failure on their second or third set. Likewise, the person who can do 15 plus reps, they're going to be like a 10 RIR on their first set. It's like really far from failure. And they're all being compared to this other group that is going to failure? So what does that mean? So in the research, when they actually do define it, you typically see 2 different types of failure. You hear what's called momentary muscular fatigue or momentary muscular failure. And that's like the legit like Menser style failure, where you must attempt a rep that you cannot complete. And you literally, failure is observed. And it's probably the most objective way to define failure. And then there's what's called volitional failure, which is the point at which you don't think you can do any more. That is like your perceived task failure, which is very common as well. And depending on the methods, which often aren't clear, this might be purely decided by the participant or some combination between the participant and the researchers who are trying to guide them to make sure they hit failure. Like, no, you got another one, let's go. Okay, now you can stop. And sometimes in volitional failure studies, there are instances of people hitting momentary muscular failure, but it's not a requirement. And then even in the way we prescribe volitional failure, that can be different. If someone is using like the RPE scale that myself and Dr. Zerdos helped introduce to the literature, that means now they actually are familiarized with the scale and trying to hit a 10. That's very different than them just going to the point where they don't think I can do anymore. In your mindset, you're thinking, okay, that was a 7, that was 8, that was a 9. I think I only do one more. Okay, was that a 10? Yeah, that was a 10. Versus I'm just going to go until I don't think I can do anymore. There's less of a continuous thought process. So that's the quote unquote different ways of measuring failure. And you might think, why does this matter? Like, it's all got to be pretty close, right? Unfortunately, it might not be close. Like when you look at the research that we have on, one, how accurate are people at gauging their actual proximity to failure, it's pretty good when they compare it to like high RPEs. Like if you want to ask someone, like if you rate something at when do you think you're only 1 rep away from failure? They're going to be pretty accurate. But when you start to ask people, which sometimes happens in these non-failure groups, when do you think you're 5 reps away from failure? They're going to probably underestimate it a good bit. And even more so, the more reps that you do in a set before you decide to stop, the less accurate that assessment of your actual RIR is. Meaning that if you're someone who's doing 20 reps and you're going to stop at 15, you're going to be probably less accurate than someone who's doing 10 reps and you're going to stop at 5. Because there's this accumulated fatigue over the course of that set that might be influencing your perception of how difficult it was. So, with that big ass old caveat, I'll probably just leave it there because we've got more to say. Is that in the scientific community, the closest thing we have to a consensus is to say, look, if you want to use failure, accurately and very specifically describe what that means, and if you're going to do volitional failure, you should probably use velocity and RIR to try to make it more consistent. And if you actually want to do failure, you should probably do momentary muscular failure so we ensure that actually occurs.
Hey, all right.
Podcast is over now.
That's it.
Bam.
To me, it sounds all very subjective. Like, really subjective. So to me, it kind of opens up even more questions than it does make any clear answers. So how important is going to failure then as far as creating hypertrophy? Like, how important is it? How often should we be touching it? Et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's a great question, Jeff. And there are some things. So okay. So we've got these. We've acknowledged that there's a lot of variability between definitions of short of failure and failure in the research. And we have all these comparisons between non-failure and failure conditions with that variability. So then we have to ask ourselves, all right, well, what can I actually conclude from that? I think the first thing that someone might just knee-jerk go is, well, screw it, we don't know anything. Well, not so much, right? What we probably have is some comparisons of actual hitting failure, momentary muscular fatigue, with a bunch of other stuff that's super close or variably far from it. So one thing we can say is that you probably don't need to go all out to muscular failure, or we would probably see a little more favoring towards the failure group, because there are conditions where people do momentary muscular failure. At the same time, we can also tell that there are costs to going to failure. And there is, I mean, Jeff, I would love to hear your thoughts. When you started training with HIIT, did you find your recovery changed?
Yeah, it was far more demanding, obviously. I mean, it's far more intense. I mean, and the way I kind of perceived failure back then is kind of how Mincer prescribed it. And then the gentleman that I was training with, I would say he didn't take it as far as Mincer did, but we were doing like just normal like rep failure, meaning can't move the bar another inch, that type of failure. And then we would even take it beyond that. Like, okay, now we're going to do 1 or 2 forced reps on top of that, and then actually do a static hold after we're done with the forced reps. And actually, I got really skilled at it. And I know, Eric, I kind of had you training that way a little bit there. And the first week you doing it, like you were struggling from a skill component. So there was skill there, but it was very demanding. And the only good thing that we did at the time, smart thing we did at the time, was we trained every other day, because there was no way I was going to be able to train with that much intensity, like 4 or 5, 6 days a week. Just wasn't going to happen. And that was in a well-fed state. So I couldn't imagine, like trying to take that type of failure in a deficit or something like that.
And that's basically what's supported by the research. So even when we have all this variability, so there's been like 3 recent meta-analyses on failure. One of them looked at the acute effects, which I think is pretty cool, by Vieira. Just got published end of last year. And generally, they looked for every kind of marker we have for fatigue or perceptual exertion. So whether it's biochemical, perceived soreness, RPE, like lactate, creatine kinase, all this good stuff. The presence of acute metabolic fatigue or peripheral fatigue or muscle damage. It's enhanced over the 48-hour period when you train to failure versus not. So that is exactly what my experience was, what your experience was, what you're describing, is that there's an additional cost. And even in studies where you're just doing like a couple more reps than the other. So those few more reps, I can understand why the failure proponents will say stuff like those last 2 reps are the ones that count. All we know for sure is that those last 2 reps are the ones that really create a recovery demand disproportionate to the reps prior to it. And that, like I said earlier, if we take a look at the data in aggregate, there's no obvious standout in terms of hypertrophy for momentary muscular failure. But I mean, if you take 2 programs that work and you put them out into the wild in the bodybuilding community, and one makes you feel more jacked up, beat up, and you can feel a change, people are more likely to associate that program with their gains. Just like, I think beta alanine, the tingles, probably help with cell more, even though it does work and it probably has a small effect, especially if you're in a high rep phase or if you're doing like concurrent training or whatever. But beta alanine is not going to be a life changer. But people, because they feel tingles, they will probably associate something positive with it, And that's kind of the way like medicine worked in the 1800s as well. Like, you're doing something. Like you definitely put leeches on me, and I feel terrible, and you made me throw up, and you're like bloodletting. So things are happening. I'm sure this is helping me. And it's like, no, actually, I'm killing you faster. But
oh, that was me. I was like, if we get done with the session, I was just wrecked. Like I remember like getting done with the leg session, going out to the car, and I couldn't even drive. I had to wait because I put my foot on the clutch, and my legs are just trembling and shaking. Like I couldn't even get the car out of gear. So I had to sit there and wait and rest up, get some fluids in me, eat something, and then, like 10, 15 minutes later, I can get out there and drive. But that feeling was just like, yeah, I did something productive here, so it has to be working. And of course, there was some results, but I mean, that's a whole nother story as to why there was results, because there's a lot more context there behind it. But yeah, that I can definitely relate to what you're talking about there.
Okay, that's good to hear, because I think it's good when you start to see people who have had in the trenches experience with something and then the research. because they don't always align if the research is done in a way that doesn't really represent what's actually being done. But I think in this case, there are obviously some similarities. And another important thing to point out is that as much as I kind of basically just said, hey, failure doesn't do anything for you except increase your recovery time course, and people are gonna like it more because of the way it feels. Well, I think it's also important to point out that we don't have any data to suggest that failure is worse. But I will say that the data is limited in what context we can conclude that. All right. So finally going to get to these meta-analyses. I know I've said that we can only trust them so much with the variability in the two groups that are being compared. But both Vieira and Gurgic did meta-analyses in last year. And when they equated volume, they found that there was no significant difference in favor of failure or non-failure. However, the effect sizes generally kind of leaned towards failure. And in one sub-analysis that Gurgic did, specifically looking at resistance-trained individuals, it actually was different. So when they only did a sub-analysis of the studies that used resistance-trained individuals, failure was a little bit better. However, that included some equated and non-volume equated studies. So what do we take from that? Well, if you read their discussion, they suggested that, maybe for people who are, past their novice stage, when they need to do something a little more to break through plateaus, failure might have its place. And I would say maybe. I'm open to that possibility. But again, we have to think about the ecological validity of all the training studies that are being meta-analyzed. And most of the training studies that are out there, we're talking 2 to 3 days per week is what's being meta-analyzed. And if you were to look at what do bodybuilders do, and we can even use studies to inform us of this. There was a pretty cool survey by Hackett in 2013 where almost all of these hundreds of bodybuilders, competitive bodybuilders who were surveyed, are training 5 to 6 days per week. Now that's competitive bodybuilders. I know we have a lot of our audience who are non-competitors, but they're very, very serious about their training. But if I had to guess, I would say 90% of them probably train 4 to 5 days a week, if I had to really pin it down, with maybe the last 10% equally split between 3 or 6 days per week. On average, certainly might go through phases where that changes or what have you. So then the question becomes, okay, what do we actually know? Well, we know there might be, in some instances, a better effect of training to failure in trained individuals when they're doing a low to moderate frequency and volume program. And I think that's kind of the limitation of what we can know there. So that's an important caveat, because if that's not the way most people are training, then, well, do we know for sure failure doesn't have a negative effect? And I think about it okay, look, if this is going to make me more fatigued for the next 48 hours, in most cases, for me personally, for the way I know I need to set up my training optimally, whatever I just hit, is half of the week, I'm going to be doing it something similar again in 48 hours. So I think for some training approaches, failure could be worse, which is something we should consider. But for those who are limited on time, limited on volume, limited on frequency, there's also a good chance that really pushing things, and redlining it might help. Because what are you doing in the next 48 hours? Working, not being in the gym. And then I think you could make a case for it.
See, with my athletes, one of our dilemmas is figuring out if we're kind of like the research on the same page when it comes to failure. So almost always when we start out, it's okay, we're gonna do something where you get the hang of this program long enough, and then we're going to see if you were right about where you thought you were in regards to your efforts. Because just from a super plain Jane perspective, it makes sense that, hey, if you train a little bit harder, you're probably going to get better results, but there probably is that point where, okay, now you just went off the cliff, right? So there's a sweet spot, and we just want to ensure that you're kind of in that sweet spot. And shoot, I'd say with a lot of athletes, a lot of people who you wouldn't expect, they're not as in sync with where they are in the set. And here's a crazy example. Almost always when I get a new powerlifter, when it comes to their main lifts, they have a very good idea of more or less where they're at. But, this is where I'm a little biased. This is the bodybuilder in me. It's hey, our accessory work is going to have a purpose. It's not there for anything. and it's insane the numbers they bring back. Like when we have our go weeks, it's like, oh, those dumbbells that we were doing for like, 8 to 12 reps, I did 24, and it's nutty. So from my perspective, it's like, okay, I know we have to be kind of like in the sweet spot. Like, sure, every once in a while, depending on how well trained you are, like what that edge is going to be, it's going to like obviously continue to climb up and move. So we must check, like, this is something I still do with myself routinely. It's I need to find out where that is, especially if I've been thriving on said movement, because it's probably different from say 4 months ago. But yeah, just even in practice, it's one of the few times where I'm like, I wish I could be there with my athletes, like at least the first few weeks, and so that we can ensure that we're on the same page, like when it comes to effort. But yeah, it's tricky, and even like for myself, like I catch myself. I was telling you guys before we started recording, there was a leg press that I took a few months ago to failure. I think I was doing it in the 10 to 15 rep range, and I blew it up for 22 or 23. And first of all, like at 18, 17, like the rational part of my brain was like, just like leave it here, because this hurts really bad. Like, this is terrible. Like my body literally felt like it was being attacked, and I'm like, you know what? We're here already. Let's keep dipping and getting some more reps. And they just kept on happening. So even for me, like every once in a while, it's like I need to recalibrate where that is, just so that I can ensure that I am being honest with my efforts, and especially even with advanced guys, because it just seems that the further away you get away from like your muscular homeostasis that your body might prefer, it's almost like the more resistant it is to like, no, we don't really need to go there. Like, this is fucking scary weight, and so I think it's important, regardless of where you're at, to like every once in a while make it a part of your system where you just figure out where that where the end of the cliff is. Basically, you don't train there. Like, you don't. That's not what's going to get you more jacked. It's all the work you did prior. But nevertheless, like even for us who are in the trenches and we have the luxury of working with some really good athletes, it's still something that it's very elusive to quantify sometimes.
That I like how you're talking about calibration there. And one thing, I'm not big on general recommendations. Like, even though people are very familiar with like my books, and kind of like I try to get them in the ballpark of probably what makes sense for most people. But I painstakingly in my book, and anytime I speak, because y'all have heard me, I always point out that, and there are exceptions to the rule, and there are many of them, and the individual differences are extremely important, and sometimes more important for you than those general recommendations. And it was like pulling teeth for me to actually write, template programs in the books. And I caveat the hell out of that. These are not templates; they're examples, But if I was to give one like general recommendation to pretty much everybody who is relatively new to like serious bodybuilding training, is if I had to put everyone on a similar program to start, it would be a low volume, moderately low frequency, failure based program with, at least on the movements that we're safe to do that with. Mm-hmm. Because I think, talking about calibration, Berto, that helps you understand where you started. And I know that for me, that was where I started. Actually, it was kind of higher volume, higher frequency, and high and close to failure. But I think the component of going to failure was really useful to me, because I have never had an issue since then gauging like where am I at, And when I do audit myself, I'm off by a little bit. And like when I worked with Jeff, that was to some degree another animal. Like when you actually start doing negatives and holds and way past it. And I do think, of course, like I think Jeff has more experience than me and is really, he knows how to stay in the pocket and hit failure. But I was certainly no stranger to the concept by the time I started thinking about. And I remember it started as Berto going, "Hey, maybe you should just, keep one or two in the tank." And I was like, "Oh, what a novel concept," So, and that was a positive thing for me. But I've now been able to, go back to failure if I want to. when I think it's appropriate, and I'm reasonably confident that I'm actually getting there or pretty damn close. And I don't know that that would be the case if I hadn't kind of front loaded that experience. So I think that's definitely something that the youngins, or at least young to the bodybuilding training, should consider.
Yeah, it always helps when those guys are supervised, because I kind of started like you, Eric, where, I saw pumping iron. I'm like, well, Arnold does 40 sets for chest, so and at a certain point, it's like you're so fatigued from taking everything to failure that, yeah, it's a lot of sets to failure, but they're not really doing a whole lot because you're lifting a fraction of the weight that you could have had you been more responsible with your volume, right? But I go back and I'm like, man, like when I was doing it, like what did some of those reps look like, perhaps? So that's another thing, and that's something that Jeff does really well, and you have to if you're going to use a system like the one Jeff used, where if you're going to, at that point he was a pretty strong dude, you're going to take sets that far, it's like you better have consistent technique for like the sake of your safety and probably your spotter as well. So that's we recommend that to the young folks. It's like, but just make sure that maybe your sets won't look exactly like Jeff's, but like that's more or less where you want to be, because you see Jeff lift, it's like even when he gets in trouble and like literally his body feels like it's being attacked by something, like nothing really changes. Like everything, it looks just like the first rep, just a whole lot slower.
I think the control should be emphasized more than actually like the load or trying to actually progress. Like you should always be in control. And I think it's a skill. So if you learn the skill, the load and the reps and the closer you get to failure, it just becomes a little more natural when you're focusing more on the control aspect of it. But while you guys were talking, I was kind of thinking, like, because a lot of the questions I get with failure from people is, how close do we need to be? Like, what's the difference in, let's say, the rate of gain if someone is going to failure versus 1 in the tank, or let's say 2 in the tank? And then I also get questions about my volume personally, because a lot of people kind of think it's low, but in reality, I mean, it's really not low because the intensity level is there. And maybe my 1 rep in the tank might be someone else's failure in comparison, just because of the skill level and that type of thing. So that's a question more for you, Eric, I guess. Like, what would be the difference? Like the rate of gain, because that's a question that's always asked. And really, I've never heard like a specific answer. I don't even know if there is one, really.
Maybe one day, like when I'm involved with some research where we actually go, all right, look, we're going to only compare volitional to non-failure, or only going to compare the studies that specified momentary muscular failure to others. And I think those effect size estimates would probably give us something. But when we look at the actual, like when we look at these comparisons and we try to get an idea of like how large of an effect is there from going to failure, that can maybe tell us something. And in general, when you're looking at like these meta-analyses, they report a couple things. The standard things you're going to see is a standardized mean difference, which is a description of the effect size. And normally the way we categorize effect sizes, if we were to, because sometimes you'll have different things. Like one is an estimate of cross-sectional area of like your quad, and the other one is your bicep muscle thickness. And we're comparing them together as a quote-unquote hypertrophy outcome. So what you have to do is, because I can't compare like millimeters of thickness to the area in centimeters cubed or whatever of another muscle. So you standardize those metrics to mathematically compare them. So you get the standardized mean difference. And generally we consider a small effect between like 0.2 to like 0.49, a moderate effect 0.5 to 0.79, and the large is 0.8 or higher. And if it's less than a 0.2 effect, it's considered trivial. Like it's pretty small, and typically those effects aren't even significantly different. So when we're talking about the effect sizes that are observed when you're comparing failure to non-failure, they're in the, especially when you equate volume, they're like in the small range. Like the larger one, Gurgic, it was like a 0.22 effect size in favor of failure that was non-significant for all the studies together. So I think the accurate view is that if you're doing a low volume program, you might have slightly better gains than if you're going to failure versus not. And what is the actual rate? Well, shit, man. Like sometimes, like here's the thing. That standardized mean difference is the average of the averages, right? So we got this study with like 20 people in 2 groups. One dude had like Ronnie Coleman-like gains from him doing the study, and the other person made some gains. And both of them, though, might have had small gains for them. Because as we know, some people one day end up winning Mr. Olympia, and some people, their family goes, I think you don't look skinny anymore. So like we all have different potential, and those are being aggregated. So overall, what I can say is if we're comparing low volume programs, you might have a small benefit at best from training to failure. But I think we can't state any more than that. And I think if you are training with moderate or higher volumes, there is a potential negative of going to failure. We haven't quantified it yet. I don't have hard data to back that up. But if you put a gun to my head and we extrapolated from the time course of fatigue and what is probably more likely to be the net kind of collective benefits that you would get from a good program, it'd be something kind of in the middle of everywhere.
What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler. We cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or an athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, in audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits for most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the products tab. Thanks for your time, and thanks for listening.
I think most of our listeners know 10 bodybuilders, like just off the top of your head. People who are, or at least very committed gym rats. And like if you had like this cluster of people, like in a study, it's like the results would be kind of nutty. Like we all know that one guy that it really doesn't matter what they do, you know? And then, you know, that bookworm that's like just inching for everything he can get, you know? And his newbie phase was maybe like 10 pounds of muscle. And then it got really hard. So yeah, that is something that just how differently people respond to training is just, it's mind blowing to me. I went to a gym where there's a huge Tongan population. So some of the things I would see, it was just like insane. Like I've told you guys, the kind of off topic here, but that real estate guy who would come in and bench press with his feet on the bench, like sets of 12. And he was literally about my size with 400 pounds, mind you, just like, and then hop on the phone call and come back. So it's insane. Like that's anyone who's been around the sport long enough understands that fact that like we all have very different responses to training stimulus. So I guess I put myself like in the listeners' shoes for a minute. So for sure, like no failure. Like we don't have to go to failure. It's probably good to go to failure to just kind of see where you're at, see how much you've progressed. But it's not a prerequisite for anything special necessarily. And I'd say like in practice, too much failure like just stops you from really having those time spans in your training where you're just like all sorts of good things are just popping off. And I think most of us, like to be on a hot streak, it's something that has to happen for like 4 or 6 weeks or something like that. And if you're constantly going to failure, like it's very difficult to create such a streak.
It's a good teaching tool, like you mentioned earlier. Because I would say like a lot of the newer athletes or intermediates that I work with, like when you see them train, and you actually see an actual set from start to finish, I would say more times than not, they're lacking effort. And oftentimes when you get someone new, they're lacking effort and they're doing a lot of volume. So it makes sense to kind of just downsize the amount of set volume frequency, and just like Eric was kind of mentioning, start them on something that's a lot lower in volume and really focus on effort, because you can become a lot more efficient. But then from there, it's like, then I'm kind of thinking about like, okay, what's this person's personality like? What's their lifestyle like? Like how much time do they actually have to train, and those types of things? Because it sounds like to me, I could be wrong, Eric, but like if I was to do, let's say 4 sets with 3 in the tank, it could be close to 2 sets, close to failure or at failure. Like the response might be very similar, and it's hard to say which one would be more optimal. So it really kind of depends on what that person's like enjoyment factor is, their time factor, and other things like that. So that's how I kind of think about like even my own training. Like, okay, what tool can I use here that makes the most sense to get the most out of my training today? And thinking ahead, like, okay, how's this going to impact tomorrow, next week, and the week after that, and so on.
Yeah, I like the way you're looking at that from a kind of an individualized, personality-based, and logistical perspective. Like let's say, like I could look at this from 2 ways. What would be the ideal circumstance, just assuming the person's fine with whatever, with how I'd start them, and then what I would do over time, without having a magic ball, not knowing what they would respond best to, what would give me the best probability of ensuring they stayed making continuous progress, or more or less continued progress. And then the other way to look at it is they could be someone who really is not well suited to training to failure for one or various reasons, or it changes, which is probably represents more people. You know, like here's an example. Someone is really busy, but not on every day. So on one of these days, but so they have 3 days to train, and one can be a long session. That long session probably isn't a great candidate for doing a bunch of training to failure, because you can actually fit in a fair amount of volume, and to make sure that session quality doesn't go down, you would probably constrain your RPE a little bit so you can get more total volume, and that would be your quote-unquote volume day, just from a logistical perspective. Then let's say you've got 2 other days of the week where you can only train 30 to 45 minutes. Yeah, you want to pick your spots and you want to go all in. You know, you would probably want to, as safely as you could, given the context of the exercise and that person's experience, get close to failure. And I don't think there's going to be anything wrong with that, and it would probably be better, you know? But yeah, I totally agree. Like, so if we go to the other scenario, like what would I do with someone just if they were just like, look, I just want to get as big as possible, and I want to make sure that I spend the least amount of my career spinning my wheels. I'd be like, all right, let's start with like 6 to 8 sets per muscle group, because I don't think it'll be too much. And let's really focus on high quality. And like you were talking about, Jeff, learn the skill of going to failure. And, you know, if you have depending on if you got a workout partner or not, I would probably be like either a 10 RPE or maybe, you know, actually attempting a few sets there. I don't think I would have people go to momentary muscular failure on purpose, except for a calibration. And I would leave them on that volume and just, you know, manipulate other variables and have deloads and all that other good stuff until I didn't think they were, like, until I thought the rate of progress slowed down too much. And then I would manipulate volume. And then I'd ask them, maybe let's come in on another day. Let's do a little bit more. And I think one of the reasons I've come to this conclusion is that when you look at some of the individual data, which actually James Krieger just recently shared with me, on like manipulating volume, you can see that sometimes, not on average, but sometimes individuals, they're doing a ridiculous amount of volume and they can decrease it and make better progress. It's not the norm. Don't get me wrong, but it does happen. So there's a really cool study, I believe by Scarpelli and colleagues in 2020, where they compared 2 groups that both were averaging about 22 sets per muscle group, which is high volume. But one of those groups got there by just being assigned it to everybody, regardless of what they were doing before the study enrollment. But the other group got there on average, but individuals were doing all kinds of different volume. And what they did was they did a 20% increase from wherever they were. So, for example, these individuals got to be in both groups, so that there's a crossover. So you got to see their response from their baseline to a individualized high volume versus a standardized volume of 22, right? So that means in some cases, like there's one particular participant who blew my mind. This dude was doing 42 sets weekly volume per muscle group before getting enrolled in the study. So that means his individualized increase by 20%
Wow.
was 50 sets. However, when he went to do this study for 22 sets, it's like a 50% decrease. And the dude grew nearly the same amount, like 3.88% in when he went from 42 sets to 22 sets, and like 3.2% when he went to 50 sets. So this guy is responding pretty similarly to doing anywhere in the range of 20 to 50 sets. So this, to me, that's just a lot of wasted time and energy without much benefit and potentially just more opportunities to get hurt. But there are other people who are probably focusing too much on the intensity side and maybe not being willing to increase their volume very much. So, for example, there was someone who they were doing 12 sets at baseline, so they went up to 14 sets for their individualized increase, and they only increased their size by like 1.6%. But when they jumped to 22, they increased muscle size by 14%. So it's like 12-fold or like 8-fold better. So this means that they had been just barely eking along, doing way too low volume for them. And when they finally did an appropriate amount of volume, they probably weren't even that fatigued in training. All of a sudden, they had this landslide of gains. So I don't think people are very good at assessing what's the appropriate amount of volume for me, because they're primarily influenced by magazine articles, Instagram posts, whatever is popular right now, what happened on the last podcast between, me and Mike Israel or whatever. And then, and like, what are the current template programs and like which voice is the loudest? I don't think people are sitting there going, you know what, I'm going to start with 8 sets when I'm a novice. And then when I plateau, I'm going to try to go up to 12 and see how it goes. Oh man, I'm actually really fatigued and I'm not progressing. I'm going to go back to 8 sets and maybe just try to do 9. Like people don't take that kind of systematic approach. And I think that's what we try to do with our athletes. And they don't realize that the volume and the failure and the frequency all affect each other. And you have to think about how to balance them and then what works best for you. And I just think like a lot of people are somewhere, they've shot in the dark and they've got to somewhere and it's either working or not, but that's about the level of fidelity they have for understanding their situation.
Like personally, like I've been training about 35, 36 years now, and I still don't know if training with Mike Minster's HIIT for 16 years was more optimal than, let's say, the last 10 to 12 years where my volume's been a little bit not high, but it's been higher than it was. But I've been like you said, I've been rearranging like the volume, the intensity, and the frequency based off of like other context. But I mean, I haven't like lost muscle, by not training to failure as much. And it's hard to say if I've actually made more muscle improvements the last 10 to 12 years versus the 16 years. I have no way to know that. Plus, there's other factors that take into consideration too, because obviously my nutrition, my sleep, my lifestyle, all that has changed over the years. So there's no way for me to pinpoint exactly like what's the rate of progress with this, what's the rate of progress with that. But I'm always like logging training and keeping data and kind of just using like the knowledge that we have, the education, the experiences that we have, and just continuing to try to evolve. But yeah, that's the questions we always get, like how much volume should I be doing, or what program's the best, et cetera, et cetera. And it's always changing. It's like dynamic in a sense.
See, I've kind of been all over the place, Jeff. Like I've done the Arnold stuff as discussed. And then I ran the Max OT program, I was so disappointed when I saw that. I remember my chest day to this day. It was 2 sets of flat, 2 sets of incline, 2 sets of fly, and I had 2 sets of triceps, and then you go home. And it really did teach me at the time, it's like, there's no redoing this set. Like, if you don't like this set, you can't, else you're breaking the program. So did that, and then eventually kind of got on the whole, like, hey, maybe more volume is not a bad thing, but if you're going to do that, you probably can't train that way. And that was when I started to like leave 2 reps in the tank. And I did see a positive response, but at the same time, you see some good happening, and the bodybuilder in you is just like, well, let me add more. And then before I knew it, I was probably doing somewhere around 20-ish sets per body part per week. And fast forward till now, it's like as like an aging bodybuilder, and like, you know, you start to feel all the dumb things you did in your 20s, basically. It's like, okay, I need to be a little bit more selective and pick my spots a little bit better. And so it's like I've gone back and I've had to take inventory of things, everything from my exercise selection. Like that's been a big one. Like, as much as I like to squat, I know that about 3 times a year my SI joint is going to not like it. So okay, maybe not worth doing. My technique, you know, it's like, as much as, hey, it's kind of nice to have all eyes on you at the gym, you know, it's like, well, these people are not going to be there like when I am like up there with my weight class and I'm getting my butt whipped because I didn't take care of business during my off season. And so those factors, like the exercise selection, the being more honest with my technique, what I can actually recover from, and not what I'm willing to do necessarily, has made it so that, okay, now my volume is like shifting downwards a little bit more. And if anything, it's created the space where I am able to, like, go to failure a little bit more often. And I have found a good security blanket in that, because it's like I kind of know where I'm at all times, because I've recalibrated my abilities on a slightly more regular basis compared to maybe what I could have done 10 years ago with like more volume. And then also, just when you have less sets, less exercises, there's just less variables to manage in the gym, you know? Like right now there's something up with my right shoulder, and I think it's because the way the hack squat like loads me up, and I can go back and retrace that. So it's a lot easier to manage all these variables compared to, you know, if I was maybe working in a place that's further away from failure, which it just could be a little bit too murky, especially as I get better. There's enough exercises there where I don't know what's doing what. So if there is one perk to going closer to failure and downsizing your volume a little bit, because you're going to have to, is just that you keep things tighter when it comes to your own personal experiment. And that's something that, like, I've seen you be able to catch like quite frequently, Jeff. It's like you introduce something, you swap something, and almost right away, before it gets any worse, and especially, you know, after your 30s, like, it's important that you keep yourself healthy. Like, that is what's going to be your bottleneck if you don't. You catch those things quickly, and you're able to make the right adjustments and then continue with your progressive training. So, man, there's just so many moving parts. There is. Like, it's insane. But yeah, for me, definitely lowering my volume a little bit has just made it easier to catch on to trends compared to, say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, man. We keep saying recalibration, and I think that's such an important aspect. Is no matter what approach you take, you need to be able to assess whether it works.
Yeah.
And if you can't, you're basically just kind of parroting theory or your beliefs about what you think is best, and you're probably just repeating it from someone else's logic. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've ran across people who will use like Mike Mentzer's arguments about why low volume, high intensity is best, or parroting a high volume approach. You know, like, well, failure is too hard to recover from, and we know volume is a primary driver of hypertrophy, so you should just be doing more volume and don't train as close to failure so you can do more volume. And like, regardless of whether that statement is true or false, or, you know, partially inaccurate, because I don't think volume is actually the primary driver of hypertrophy. It's progressive overload, and then how much of that do you need is volume. So like, yeah, like if I look past all those potential misstatements, the real issue there is that you're just saying that. You haven't actually assessed what do you need and what has and hasn't worked for you previously. And I do agree that when you have less variables, like motherfucking Jeff only has like 6 exercises he does, right? You know, so like this
6
what, 9? What do you got? How many?
I'd be surprised if it's over 10.
It's a little more. Like this last week or two, I've actually done. But what I've done is
not last week, like historically. How many exercises you got?
Historically, yeah, and I on average anywhere between 9 to 12 in my program at one time.
Okay, so I was only cutting that in half to make my point. But what I'm getting at is that I think it's a really good point, Berto, is that when you only have a few moving parts, changing something makes it very clear as to what's happening. But if you have an entire shoulders day that is 12 sets, then which one of those is causing your niggle? You don't know. It's very difficult. Or you have to go through multiple trial periods. And that's not necessarily an argument to choose a subpar program that's lower volume, but it is a perk. Mm-hmm. And I think it also just tells us that we need to be attentive to these details. And I think volume should be added not because volume's quote unquote good, but because you've found that what you're currently doing isn't sufficient, and you've taken care of all those other things. Which, like you said, Berto, when you're on a low volume program, the quality tends to go up because you want to get more out of what you are doing, rather than thinking about all the stuff you have to do. And then one minor total aside that I just can't let myself not correct. The study, Scarpelli, wasn't a crossover. It was a within subject design. So one leg in each person did the individualized, and the other leg did the so it was like, they did unilateral leg training on both legs, single leg press, leg extension, and then one might have done in that one guy's case 22 sets versus 50. And that's really important because a crossover study wouldn't have worked, because then their prior volume would have been whichever group they had just done. So if anyone who was science-minded was like, what? That's just my misspeaking, and now I've corrected that, and I will be quiet.
That's nice to hear. Is like using, I guess, the person as a control is something that is so fucking convenient, I guess.
And it controls for all like genetic differences. Yeah, it's a really good way of doing it.
So you got one dude walking around with one big leg, one small one.
It's basically Lady in the Water.
Lady in the Water. I was gonna say, what is that movie? Exactly. Yeah, that was it. Yep, one big arm.
Shyamalan.
So how important it is to go to failure then?
I think it is important if you're doing, if that's the primary variable that where your stimulus is coming from. I think as you start, like if you start to get indications that the low volume program wasn't working that well for you, and by the way, unfortunately, this can be body part specific. That awesome experiment that I did with you, Jeff, where I was driving down to Stockton and training with you, I legit shrunk in my upper body.
You shrunk your upper body.
Yeah, and Jeff was there. He can confirm my loads were going down. However, I think I also hit like a 3-year PR in RDL. So I was like, God damn it.
And I'll even say this, like the skill level wasn't like super high, but it was definitely like the effort level was there. Like you were freaking grind. I had you grinding, so it wasn't like
you did.
Lack of effort is why you shrunk. It was legit. You actually gave it an honest go, and you found your answer. Yeah. So that's the thing with failure is like, again, it's subjective, right? So if we have people that are doing low volume and high intensity, are they truly pushing the effort level where it needs to be in order for that to work? And you found out, I did exactly that and it didn't work. So that you can basically just take, I can throw that out the window now. So now you're like removing one thing and that's not going to be part of your toolbox. So I think a lot of people, they just like, especially with failure, it's very subjective. And if you can't really define it on your own, then you actually probably should get someone else who's basically kind of done it, experienced it, and knows what they're kind of talking about with it to kind of give you an honest feedback with that. And that's something we do with our athletes. I know we kind of look at form. It's not just, let me look at your exercise form. Let's actually see the set all the way to the end where you're actually going to failure. And I often ask them, like, what do you think that was? 1 in the tank? Was that 2 in the tank? Was that failure? Let them kind of say what it is. And then I'll look at it and go, I don't think that was failure. You had like 4 more, dude. So then it kind of tells me right there, like, okay, should this person be adding more volume to their program? Probably not. Like, because there's a lot more efficiency to be had. But anyways, I went on a tangent there.
No, that's not a tangent. That's really good. Because, you basically said, hey, for this person. Because I remember, I tell the stories of when I first started training and how we do force reps and all that stuff. But I was definitely less skilled. It wasn't that I wasn't going to failure. It was that failure was happening with momentum and changes in form and potentially changes in range of motion. Like I was like training hard. Don't get me wrong. And anyone looking would have agreed. But it was sloppy, So I think I got de-slopped by Jeff, which is oddly sound sexual, but I promise it wasn't.
Sloppy.
No, D-slop. Jeff made you more pure.
D-slopped. I got D-slopped.
Okay.
Yeah.
He made you more pure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm driving down and to Stockton to go to Jeff's garage, and he's de-slopping me a couple times a week. So, the thing is, everyone feels uncomfortable when I said that, but you can't pin down why. That's the best part. So anyway, that I think was a really useful experiment, and it's really useful for anybody because I had this perception of, oh man, I used to push it too hard, and what I needed was to get a little more work in without, just crushing myself. But what I then came to learn was, I didn't really turn that stone over. I kind of sloppily, smacked it around a little bit. And then with Jeff, I really did turn that stone over and I went, okay, so this can work for the lower body. It feels terrible, doing this kind of training for squats and RDLs, but it's viable. But not so much up top. Like I just need more work. And you can take a small amount of work and simply make it as hard as possible. But if it's not enough work, it's not enough work. Okay, so I moved on. And I think that was, even though like some people be like, well, you wasted months of training. Like, no, I didn't. Like that gave me the confidence to move forward to then make progress for years. And I think you just have to be willing to put in that lab time, if you will, and really commit to something and really turn over that stone, if you will, to know what you can and can't do. And I think out of all the variables that are out there, failure is one of the easier ones to do because once you get the skill that's there and you're going to have to do a low volume, low frequency approach. So it kind of really helps you isolate and tell, is this working? Is this effective? And there is an objective, point of failure. If we talk about momentary muscular failure that a workout partner or an experienced coach can help you with, while with volume, it's like, one person's moderate volume is another person's low volume is another person's high volume, and you can kind of always just keep tacking on sets. So it's very difficult to know where should you have been or should you go.
I kind of experiment like opposite of you, Eric. I remember I experimented, it was about 2016, I think it was, 2017, somewhere in there when volume, like set volume, like adding set volume throughout the mesocycle was starting to become really popular. I tried it. And it was kind of like the same thing that you experienced. Like it generated was fatigue and aches and pains. And I didn't see like any improvements in my physique whatsoever. So I'm like, okay, I don't need to add that much volume in. I can cruise along just with lower volumes and manipulate my intensity levels and all that. So yeah, it's good to get out of your comfort zones and kind of go to like one extreme and then the other to kind of see the differences there. But you have to give it honest go, like not just like, hey, I tried that program for a week. It's like, no, you gotta be in the trenches for like at least a month or two, at minimum, to kind of see and experience it firsthand. So I think I trying to encourage people not to just get stuck in a bubble or into certain specific camps. So, because that's what happened to me for 16 years. Like Mike Mentzer's hit was like, oh, okay, this is the way to train. And it just didn't help me. It just basically brought up a lot of walls. So it's always good to experiment personal trial and error.
I think also the benefit of the lower volume approach, and especially when you push things close to failure, is you can see which exercises for you really can take to the house like that. Because not all of them are well suited for that, in my opinion. Some load a single joint too much. Some just have too many opportunities for you to cheat, and you just can't be consistent with it. Some you're not going to feel safe unless you've got a workout partner, which, like if you train at home, that's a no-go. Some the risk is just not worth it. And you can also tell which ones are you hitting failure because another muscle group is failing early. Like is your grip giving out? Is it a synergist? So I think it can actually help you make more efficient choices on your exercise selection, which then when and if you do need to go higher volume, you probably won't need to go as high volume because you're having a more effective tool set. And that's kind of where I'm at now in my training. Like I still do higher volume for my upper body, and I use volume to manipulate as a progressive overload variable. But I tend to have less exercises and more sets per exercise now than I would have used to, where I was just kind of like running all over the goddamn gym to do like every kind of angle and variation. So, and I think that was probably a direct consequence of having those opportunities to train. Like, dude, man, my old chest day with Adam Ripa, It used to be like incline, it'll be like flat, incline, decline, dips, flies. That's stupid.
How many sets? How many sets?
Like 3 each. You got to do 3. You know, 3 is the number.
At least.
And then
at least.
and then forced reps. It's just dumb. Like I don't even understand. So but now like I might have 5 sets of incline and then 5 sets of close grip or something like that, you know. So I think and so yeah, anyway, I think that's just another one of those side benefits, if you will, from taking this approach, at least for a time period.
You know, like Jeff described, when you take it too far, whether it's volume or failure, if you've been doing this long enough, there's just, as much as we keep saying like, hey, you can't always trust what you're feeling, right? There's this feeling where when things are going well, like, you know, your body's very predictable, you're making progress. It's like this certain level of freshness that you just learn to associate with, like, I'm executing things well everywhere. And that's kind of sort of what you're looking for. So whenever I'm kind of off track, I kind of go back to, am I feeling this way? Because when I'm feeling that way, and anyone who's had a hot streak happen, like they know what it's like. It's like, that's where you want to be. And when Jeff experimented with a little bit more volume, like that's exactly the feedback he got. He was just like, this is not that feel good feeling where, hey, you're definitely putting in the work. You're definitely a little bit tired from your training, but there's a sweet spot for that.
Well, that's where experience level comes in, because I'm experiencing that. I know something doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
So instead of just, hey, you know what, X, Y, and Z out there is telling me I need X amount of sets, I need to stick with this no matter how I feel. I'm like, no, I'm listening to what my body's giving me. Let me take it back. Let me take it back to the middle ground. So that's a lot of times that's what I see online is people just get caught up with, okay, we need to be doing X, Y, and Z according to said person, and they kind of just disregard how they're actually experiencing things. I think it's super important that you're in tune with what you're actually experiencing and take notes. Like after you, like if you have a low volume day and you went to failure on every set, write about it. Take notes. How did it make you feel? What did your joints feel like? What was like? Did you feel like you got hit by a truck the next day? Were you tired? Were you motivated to train the next day? These types of things will kind of give you some clues as far as like how you're recovering, where your fatigue is at, and it kind of help you manage your training thereafter, like how to adjust the variables.
And you got to stick with it for a little bit, to go back to Jeff's point, because I don't think it can be reiterated enough. Because if you go 2 weeks and you haven't been training to failure, and you train to failure, you're just going to feel like trash. Like that's the primary thing you're going to learn. Likewise, if you were training 8 sets and you go, you know what, let me go to 15 sets on everything, you just doubled your volume. You're going to feel like trash for 2 weeks because you haven't actually increased your workload capacity. So like you actually have to give your body the opportunity to adapt to the new thing you're trying, and then to don't just take notes on the adaptation phase. You have to get used to it. I mean, Jeff, was it like 3 months that I trained with you?
I can't remember how long it was, but it was long enough.
Yeah. Because I did start to adapt. Like I could handle it. It wasn't at first. It was like I'm brutally sore. This is incredibly hard, and I'm glad Jeff's here for me to actually have the motivation and focus to do this to a high quality during the session. But eventually, it was like, yeah, I can do this. This is something I'm now accustomed to. And then finally it got to the point where it's like, I don't want to keep doing this because I don't think it's working up top, So, but I wouldn't have gotten there at all. I wouldn't have had confidence that actually knew that until I had, actually learned the skill and then gotten just really the repeated bout effect to that initial kind of stressor and that type of training. So, yeah.
That was about what I ran for the higher volume, about 2 or 3 months of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good point.
Exactly.
Thanks for throwing that in there.
You got it. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground, team. We covered the research, which is, it seemed like if you were just to read the research on failure, you'd be like, it's about the same, but maybe slightly better for resistance trained individuals. And I would just say that could end up being the case, but just remember the context in which those variables are researched, which is typically lower frequencies and volumes than most people are training, and with varied definitions of non-failure and failure. So I think we still have some pretty big question marks going on in that realm. And just like always, the best data is the data you uncover from yourself.
Hey guys, this is Coach Alberto Nunez. Thanks so much for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys that we have a giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The vault is a place where we have organized our best information, paired it up with some of our favorite resources, and shared with all of you guys in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole lot more. Most of it is free. Some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple of months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.